So, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event, which is No Eden, featuring Robert Fitzmaurice and Lucy Cox. Robert is the artist who's been holding our latest exhibition, and it's been a complete pleasure to have him and to also have Lucy along today. They'll explain a little bit more about this event, which has been sponsored by the Arts Council, and I'll just tell you a little bit, just a few minutes or seconds really, about the venue. We're here this afternoon in Greenham Common Control Tower, which is a control tower on Greenham Common, as the name suggests. This is a 1951 building built in response to the Cold War of the 1950s, and run by the US Air Force. The airfield, if you fast forward about 40 years, the airfield was closed in the early 90s when what I call the Second Cold War ended and thawed as a result of the INF Treaty between Gorbachev and Reagan. And this tower was one of the very few buildings that was saved after the closing of the airfield. It's lovely to have the common back, but it's also nice that we've still got one building and we've been able to open it up as a community hub, a cafe and a gallery featuring temporary exhibitions, and also another exhibition room with the permanent exhibition. The tower reopened in 2017, so that was a long time after it closed. It was a struggle to get here, but we got here thanks to funding from Greenham Trust, the social investment business, and the Heritage Lottery Fund. And so here we are today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Lucy and Robert.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Lucy Cox. I'm an artist curator, member of Contemporary British Painting, and I have artwork in the Price and Seabrook collections. And I also host and produce the Painters Today podcast. And one of those guests was the lovely Robert Fitzmaurice.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi Lucy. Hi. So a short introduction about me. Originally from Coventry. I painted all my adult life. Well, I started painting when I was a teenager. Went to art college, did my degree in Sunderland, came to Reading to do my postgraduate, where at the time I was tutored by the British constructivist painter Adrian Heath, and then stayed on in Reading doing various jobs until I went full-time as an artist in 2015. And No Eden came about through, we're going to talk about today, really as a third part. It became a third part of a trilogy of exhibitions to do with militarism and power and gender roles. So that's a little bit about me. I believe you've got some questions for me.
I do indeed. I think it would be good to start with companion pieces and also Soldier, two exhibitions that you had last year, particularly companion pieces that you showed at the No Format Gallery in London. Secondly, how they were the predecessors to to this exhibition, No Eden, and how No Eden evolved from those two shows. Sure.
So for the benefit of the people in the room, there are slides here which show, give an example of both exhibitions. Soldier was an invitation to show at Sandham Memorial Chapel, where Stanley Spencer did a cycle of paintings based on his experiences during the First World War in Greece. Obviously a profound effect on him. Sandham Memorial Chapel has a small exhibition area, and I was invited to show there, and because this was 2018, it was the 100-year anniversary since the end of the First World War, and I thought, what exhibition do I want to put on here? I need to respond to that. It was very much in the news, and I thought I just can't bring Rob's work from the last few years and mount a show of what I've been up to. I decided to devise an exhibition around Soldier, but it wasn't really, that didn't pose any problems to me. It wasn't that I needed to go off-piste and invent a new type of work to address that theme. For a long time I'd been very interested in At that time I would describe it as a human condition and rites of passage, but both of those terms you find an awful lot of painters, an awful lot of artists working in that territory. So those are kind of things that I find as soon as you say that, some people will immediately turn off. But anyway, that's what I was very interested in. It's a crowded marketplace, but what I was drawing on were my own particular experiences as a child, myself, reflecting on the dynamics of family as I saw it, and how there were gaps between, and I couldn't really articulate in this way at the time, but the gender roles, the stories that we all tell ourselves about what it means to be a father, what it means to be a child, a male child, what it means to be a boy growing up, 60s, 70s, in the playground, what the mother, your mother will tell you makes you a good boy and a bad boy and so on. I was very interested in those sort of narratives and reflecting, using my art as a lens back to my own childhood really, but also things that I'd read in literature and so on. So there are examples of the boy become man in Shakespeare, and the whole idea of where does a warrior come from. All these are sort of things I started to try and bring into my work for Soldier. So it's about the cost of war. It's trying to get stuff under the radar of just commemorating, you know, doing a few poppy paintings or something that was a bit obvious about the loss, and, you know, maybe I could have, if I was a different artist, channeled the First World War poets, Wilfred Owen, etc. All of that didn't really appeal to me. I wanted to try and get something longer term around masculine roles and how complex those are, and maybe just get into people's heads about how we all relate to the sacrifices soldiers make and what we think about it. So I wasn't being didactic, I wasn't trying to particularly grind an axe in one direction. I do have some quite strong feelings about those myself, but I wanted to use my paintings to open up debate, and I've tried to do that, and I'll talk more about that in the context of No Eden later. So that was Soldier, and then there's a gallery in Deptford called No Format Gallery, a very nice little space, but as you know, it's been out in the sticks. And I'd had this show booked for a while in October, and I wanted something quite different from Soldier, not because I hadn't enjoyed doing it, I enjoyed doing it very much. But I decided, after struggling with many different titles, to call it Companion Pieces. And I was thinking a lot more. I wanted to make this show. Soldier had been strongly about those themes. With Companion Pieces, I wanted to work with similar sort of topics, similar themes around gender identity in particular, what makes a figure, but deal more in material terms and the whole idea of the double. So I set up all sorts of formal things pictorially to do with taking an image that had been printed, cutting and slicing, and then producing that image again next to it in proximity, either attached or in the form of a diptych. And then I would use colour and tone, but always thinking about dualities. So I'd quite often have high contrast work, dark light, or I'd have textured work, hard edge work against very soft and pastel work. And I would also move through different media, so I'd try and relate the three-dimensional figures to things that were going on in 2 dimensions and then come back out again. So I got a body of work that was all about not so much a subject that somebody could come in and say, oh, Rob's painting about, you know, a soldier. There's nothing identifiable to the external world. They were much more, I suppose, for the want of a better word, abstract. But you end up down a rabbit hole when you start talking about figuration and abstraction as two sort of extremes. There's a lot of things going on in between, and that's kind of rich territory for me to move in. I like the idea of thinking about representation and the limits to what works and what doesn't. It's still a mystery to me. It's not like I'm talking as if I understand in advance how things are going to go. There are surprises that come out of when you're trying to commit to something on a rectangle or any surface, stuff comes out that you don't expect, and you have to work with that and not necessarily dominate it, but you have to work with it, what it's telling you. And that's why it's quite good for me to work in series, because you don't always get the thing going in the direction you want. So companion pieces was very much around that. But as you know from the talk we did at the time, some of the subjects in there were to do with the sense of self and the fact that in the work, these strange sort of creatures that have emerged that I keep putting into the work, the biomorphic creatures, in a sense, were a cipher, a way of relating back to my role as the artist. You know, I want to make a figure all the time, and there's a trace left of me actually working and making the figure and doing stuff on the surface. That is what we were talking about over lunch, the idea of the quasi-person that Isabel Graff talks about in her many books. That is a term, and that is a whole area that I'm getting more and more interested in as I go about my own private practice. I'm trying to think what that means, and doesn't necessarily mean that I have to introduce something that looks like a human figure into my work. That is more about leaving the trace of my handiwork in the work and referencing that. So maybe I'm talking a little bit too much about companion pieces and soldier. I don't know whether that's a good enough summary to kind of explain that there were two shows in summary that preceded No Eden, but when you look around the room in here, there are things in No Eden that relate back to those two shows. There's a couple of paintings on the far wall that were in the two in the black frame, so the Unnameable and Layer Man behind us here. Both of those were in Soldier. Yeah. So the altered states, the identity, the dualism between child and man, with No Eden, we'll talk about it in more detail, the whole idea of feminism and militarism, pacifism, militarism, patriarchy and feminism. All those dualisms are there that were points of departure for me, really.
And how do those themes, the quasi-person, the dualisms, how does that, in this exhibition, relate to the history of Greenham?
Well, the history of Greenham, I had to focus in. There's a very long history here,
yes, yeah.
Very long, going back to prehistoric times. But and again, I called it No Eden because I very ambitiously, I had all sorts of ideas about wanting to point out that certainly in the times we live in now, there's no Garden of Eden as such. You can't run away from somewhere anywhere. We've been, if you believe in such things, or to take the original biblical metaphor, we've been well and truly evicted from any Garden of Paradise, yeah? Mm-hmm. And effectively the garden we do have is in almost terminal decline. We're in a really, really bad place. Hence the title. How do those things relate to No Eden and Greenham? I guess specifically to do with the peace camps. The advent of cruise missiles coming to the UK, the walk from Wales in 1981 to come and just try and have a discussion with the powers that be, John Knott, with the people here at the base, to actually say, we object to this. Yeah, they were treated with such derision that they decided to stay, and the peace camps arose. To me, as I started to read, I started to research, I thought, yes, very much, I want to talk about the peace camps here. And that polarity between what those women who came here decided to do, how they shaped those peace camps, the fact that they made them women only, that for me, as a man reading that, you have to position yourself to that and understand why. At first I felt like, well, men, I'm sure some men were supportive, and you read a bit more and you realise some men were, they came and helped. But the reasons why the women chose that were very strong and justifiable. And so you ended up with this thing, within the base you had the patriarchy as such, again a very loaded term, but it's out there. very male interior, and then the fence, and then on the outside 8 or was it 9 camps of women, orange gate, blue gate, green gate, etc., all with a different character but very much opposed to what was inside. So a very contentious historical moment, but nevertheless mapping onto my particular interests when it comes to painting that are quite broad about polarities, dualities. Yeah. Fantastic to work with, you know.
So that kind of split, you've got the fence, and then on either side of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, the two essentially.
Yes. So there are other questions I know that, because you've shared them with me kindly, I know that are coming up. So I'm not going to. I can expand a little bit later about the fence motif and where that led me. Yeah. So where are we going next?
And so, putting those themes aside, what new source material have you discovered from the site for these artistic themes, particularly power and gender roles?
Well, maybe what we ought to do, to answer that question in context, why don't I move on to the next slide? Yeah. Because then what we can do is talk maybe about, in more detail, about some of the works from companion pieces. So here, for example, we've got Doc 1 and Doc 2, and which were in companion pieces, and then it's a very dark work which doesn't really show up on the slide, Deity. Now I'll talk about Doc 1 and Doc 2 first. I was, as part of the show, starting to work with ceramics. These are 2 ceramic pieces, a diptych again, so they're the most abstract to my figures, if you like. They are elements of. They were originally paintings, and I recreated them in ceramic, but they are 1/9, which ties into the 96 Bad Boys. They are 1/9 of a very large canvas made up of small canvases. Okay, and I took this canvas, and there are elements of it that they all joined together like to make something more reasonable. So that is actually partly from a chair, but they look like French loaves. They're totally out of context. And I reproduced it twice, because it was a cast. I made a mould in plaster, and then glazed them, and then docked them together, and you end up with a third image that suggests something else very different to the original object that it was referring to. I've created something else, and it suggests all sorts of things, from a boat to elements of the figure. It could be an eye, it could be sexual organs, it could be all sorts of things. It's an open image for me, but the word dock was chosen to. This is a particular interest of mine. Multi-layering, not encouraging people to think, oh, the work can mean absolutely anything, but multi-layering my images so that they're not just tied to one particular subject. So here, the gallery, no format, is down in Deptford with the history of the docks. So I was thinking about these things, you know, stuff coming away and then coming back together. A dock is where things is made, but dock can also be a verb, yeah? And there's also a coming together, and there's a slightly, very, very subliminal sexual thing going on in there, and dock is also coitus as well. And I was quite happy for those things to be quite buried in the work, but I've had a few people who have looked at it and liked it and come up with those readings, so I'm quite happy about that, because they are quite hidden. Well, I felt they were anyway. And the partner piece to it is just a dark version. I was working with surface, and I wanted to contrast. When you actually see the piece, it's very, very shiny, it's glazed, it's very reflective, and there's a little nod in it to a Florentine Florentine artist, or family of artists called Della Robbia's, who made, if you go around Tuscany, you'll see in a lot of churches, Luca or Andrea della Robbia, and they had a particular way of working with ceramics that look like paintings, but they're clearly not, because they're in 3 dimensions, but they're on the wall, and they adopt they adopt the language of painting. So you have a Madonna and child coming out, they're in an arch, they're surrounded by oranges and lemons. And the glazes use this white. They have a white, they have a beautiful blue, a yellow and a green are the normal sort of Della Robbia colours. And when I first saw them years ago, I hated them. I thought, no, give me an oil painting any day. But I looked at these and they're absolutely fantastic. They're quite individual. So when I started working with clay, I wanted to try and reference that. So the one on the right is me rebelling against that trend and trying to find my own way in the clay, and I drew loads of lines in and it became very nice and textured and something else entirely. Moving on to Deity,
which is in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Just for the audience, it's just over there.
Yeah, I'll put that image on the slide later. Deity takes the idea of the cruise missile as a subject, but presents it as if you're looking up in the night sky, looking up to a cloudy night. There's a few stars, so I'm typically maybe going down the illustrational route a little bit, sort of really trying to recreate something that looks like a night sky there. But the cruise missile's changed somehow, and it's changed in the way that takes it back to my particular interest, which formally in a painting I'm very interested in putting the figure frontal on. We talked about this in companion pieces, how the figure is presented directly towards the viewer. So you as the audience, you as the spectator are standing in front of the art, and coming at you out of the picture is a figure which may, whether it's Doc, very abstract, or Silo Man, or most of the time the figure is like that. Why? Because I'm very interested in devotional art from all cultures, whether it's Indian art, Christian art, Buddhist art, whatever. The deity, the spirit, is normally presented in a way that addresses the viewer direct on. Obviously there are periods of art history where you get the altar pieces of Rubens or something and they're coming in from all angles, yeah? But generally across time there are examples again and again in sculpture as well as painting of the figure being presented quite directly, and I find those very powerful. Why? I don't know, and I'm not particularly, I think it's very, you probably need an art psychiatrist to work out why, but why do I prefer that more to something that is more illusionistic? I don't know, it's just maybe our tastes, isn't it? But that's what I like working with. So Deity is titled in that way to nod to the fact that the cruise missile for many people, and here we come on to the language of still current, of Trump, of Kim Jong-un, of Putin, of I forget the name of the Indian politician who, when India became a nuclear power, he said, now nobody will be able to call us eunuchs. You know, there's that language about weaponry that links it to, worships weaponry almost. And to underline my point, we had a service happen within the last month, I think, in Westminster Abbey. Or was it Westminster Cathedral Abbey? It would be the cathedral, wouldn't it? Cathedral. Celebrating, is it 40 or 50 years of nuclear weapons? There's a big protest against it. It's like, how can we be doing this? But the powers that be, you know, in terms of celebrating military prowess, it's going on. Most countries do it. A lot of people don't like it, but some people do. They love it. And that's what we're fighting against, you know. People actually embrace the idea that it's okay to have 96 cruise missiles hosted here in the 80s, and people didn't see an issue with that. They thought it was a symbol of, you know, a sign of strength. So that whole male virility thing, the whole frontality thing, the whole link to the phallic imagery, all of those sort of things I've been trying to bring in and subvert people's readings of stuff to say, what is going on here? Yeah.
And that's also the same for Blue Fixer and Scribe. So Scribe is shown in the exhibition, and Blue Fixer was a painting that you had in the companion pieces show. Again, it's, you know, it's flat, it's very front on, and yeah, they are very similar, I think.
Well, these crazy figures, I call them, very crazy. They emerged from a series called Blue Boy, which I'd started about 2015, which kind of referenced Gainsborough's Blue Boy, the young sort of guy blowing bubbles, you know, and just sort of used on Pear's soap, I think. But it started out as almost me making the figure and then projecting myself in it, using it as a prop to realise stuff. But then he kind of became this strange, scurrying, multi-legged figure. And I put him to lots of different scenarios that didn't have to do with me. He just became an actor that I could give different jobs to. And the Fixer series came out of my interest. My wife is Cantonese, and as I went to Hong Kong more and more, I started to understand that particular 19th century history, what the Brits had done through the East India Trading Company and the opium that moved from British provinces in India up to China, so that they could get the silver to buy the tea off the China back to Manchester and London and whatever. So it involved all those different trades, it involved the cotton mills in Britain and so on. But the dirty part of it was the opium that moved from India back into Canton and fueled 2 opium wars. And that's an incredible history. It's an uncomfortable one to read as a, you know, if you're British, you need to understand what went on there. And the Fixers were my attempt to reference the merchant class on both sides, so the Chinese as well, who were devious, and they kind of collaborated to get that trade going. So it's a pretty bad. The British really took an existing use of opium in China and mercifully, brutally rather, manipulated that until they created a whole class of addicts. Very bad. So anyway, that's where the Blue Fixer came from. And again, I was using a sort of I was referencing devotional art, religious sort of the crucifix idea, but that's where the fixer comes from too, that he's kind of fixed on the picture plane. There's very little illusionistic space there. The scribe, obviously, again, it's a crucifix idea, but here it's a mixture of a deity and a sort of cruise missile shape, bomb shape, but he's holding a chalk. And what I wanted to kind of make that a nod to was the idea that quite often, back to narrative, our histories are written by the people who win the wars. And quite often there's another set of stories to be told by the people who didn't win. Yeah. So whatever you think about the Vietnamese War, we're all very familiar with the deer hunter perspective and the criticism of the war in the West. But we went to Ho Chi Minh City for a holiday once and went to the military museum there, the equivalent of the Imperial War Museum. And when you see things from the other side, and I'm not taking sides, when you see things from the other side, it's really quite shocking. You actually look at things afresh. You start to understand, you know, all the terrible things the Viet Cong did, but you can also see some of the documentary evidence of what those American soldiers did. So you really get the horror of war, you know, which is an overused term, but yeah, anyway, enough detail on that terrible period. And if we go on to the next...
Raider Exchange and Silo Man 1.
Yeah.
So Silo Man 1 is in the room somewhere.
Yeah, it's just down here,
just down here. Yeah.
And Raider Exchange. So Raider Exchange was in Soldier. You may look at these and think there's nothing to connect them, possibly from a certain connection formally in terms of the use of black and the sort of delineation and so on, but subject-wise it's a bit hard to see. But to me they're kind of connected. It was not quite nice that you chose these combinations of images to put together.
I was thinking about the multi-layering and how you've and how you can see different layers of meaning in both of those. So with Silo Man, I'm not sure about the audience, but to me it looks almost phallic. Yeah. And likewise with Braid Exchange as well. I can see that as well. Yeah.
There is a little shape in the middle that sort of a sort of lozenge shape that he seems to be handing something over. That painting references a painting by Velázquez, the Spanish painter, and it is the victory of the Spanish forces over the Dutch, and it is the figure on the right is a transcription of the victorious Spanish general. He's Genoese actually, I think, but he was leading the Spanish forces, and the figure on the left that's bending forward slightly is offering him something. He's offering him the keys to Breda in the original painting. It's in the soldier catalogue. What it does tremendously, it's absolutely spectacular painting where the figures are life size. It's either the Prado or the Louvre. I think it's the Prado. It's just spectacular. Anyway, I could rave about it all day. I haven't tried to transcribe it, but I'm certainly referencing it. To me, for the soldier show, it was a very important work for me to reference because it shows a side of the military world that I think is about respect and magnanimity. I can never get my teeth around those words. But generosity of spirit in defeat, that the victorious can show incredible respect towards the conquered forces. But of course, Velázquez and the people who commissioned it, the Spanish, it's propaganda as well. You know, it's saying, hey, look, aren't we the good guys? We're not going to destroy you all. But the composition itself, all the spears, it's also known colloquially as the spears, because all the spears of victorious forces, all very straight and rectilinear, they're up like this. All the horses look very powerful. The troops still look like they've got energy within them to fight. On the left-hand side of the painting, everything's in disarray. Breda is in the background smoking. All the spears are at angles, and they all look a bit tired. So there's that nice exchange between men of war, men prepared to kill, but nevertheless there's rules of engagement there. So I wanted to make a little bit of art around that. But we'll get onto the erotic aspect in a minute, because another theme that has occupied me for a long time is the Shakespeare's play Coriolanus and the relationship between the main character, the eponymous character, and his arch rival Aufidius. And many productions of Coriolanus have eked out the subtext, which is basically there are two alpha males, but they're actually kind of almost in love with each other. It's quite often played with quite an erotic charge between them. And whereas that doesn't interest me personally, it does interest me artistically, because I think there's a lot of buried sort of stuff going on there that I think is timeless. I think Shakespeare really nailed something there, because his arch rival goads him, he taunts him, but it's almost like a lover's tiff, and he calls him a boy of tears. It results in Aufidius, his rival, stabbing him, killing him, and then he ends up, he says, all my rage is now gone, and you know, he's also mourning this guy he's just killed. It's bonkers. And to me, that's kind of a very good counterpoint to what happens in the Breda exchange. It's when you get the messed up stuff, for want of a better way of putting it, the subtext of war, you know, and that whole macho thing. And you know, we've got Putin. I don't know if you've seen those photographs of Putin riding his horse without his shirt on, but it's that same sort of thing. You know, look at me, how tough I am, and you know, I've got an issue with that. I've got an issue with all that side of the masculine thing. It's just kind of, yeah. It's the same with motorbikes that go past you on the motorway, and they've got to make a loud noise to show that they're there. You know, it's that kind of thing. It's like, come on, you know. So yeah, that just kind of. So in Silo Man, you're absolutely right. It's really nice you picked up on it, because the key in this has actually become a lot more ambiguous, and the connection between the figures has become a little bit more ambiguous, and the play between positive space and negative space has become ambiguous, because the black is actually painted over the blue brush marks. So you've got this whole ambiguous thing going on there, like silhouettes. But where the keys have been, that now looks a little bit more like, well, what is it he's handing him exactly, you know? And that is echoed, that sort of shape is echoed in this black shape, which is again meant to be a figure, but it's also, I mean, if you've changed, if that morphed, the Silo Man figure on the right, if you take that black shape and you actually lower it down, so the neck, the conjunction of the two shapes, bring it down a little bit, it is a bit like, if we just go back, here, sorry, there, on the blue fixer, if you just take the blue shape, it's that shape with a horizontal head, yeah? But, yeah, in this context, I wanted to, in terms of Silo Man, let's just talk about silo quickly. The term silo, when I first came to Greenham Tower, I saw the 6 bunkers over there. I said, yeah, and the silos are over there, silos are over there. Of course, silos are underground. So it is, I'm right, Meg, aren't I? They should be called bunkers, yeah, because they're all shelters, yeah. But what I wanted to do here, I'm quite happy to call it Silo Man, because I wanted the whole idea about, I mean, in the corporate world of which I was part, and especially in IT, we would talk about silo thinking, where you either have teams or individuals that are so caught in their particular mental mindset they can't get out of them. So that's why I'm referencing here. But obviously the whole idea of a missile sitting within its concrete container as well. There's, again, coming back to the whole idea about virility and masculinity and that connection quite often between the potency of a weapon and the potency of a man. I'm quite happy for people to read that sort of phallic imagery into it. There are, if you look very carefully, either side of it, there are 2 pale areas, little figures, left and right, bent over slightly. I don't know if you can see those. Either side of the dark shape, either side. And if we go back here on the blue fixer, they're black either side of the head. They come down like sausages with 2 little things. They were meant to be, they grew out of the mother-father idea that you'd have the child in between and then the parents either side. But then later, because going back to the multi-layering idea, I wanted to keep that parental thing, but also reference the headdresses that the merchants quite often would wear in the 19th century in Canton. So there's a sense of presentation there as well. But that's just an aside. The same forms are emerging in my work through that.
I can see them now.
Yeah.
The two white kind of rings around there.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'd better move on.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
2 of my favourite paintings in the show are the Night Bears and 96 Bad Boys, 960 Hiroshimas. Firstly, for the Night Bears, because you've taken something that's traditionally very cute, or what we know as kind of cute and cuddly, and you've kind of subverted the meaning and made them very kind of cruel and almost kind of violent in some ways. And likewise with the 96 Bad Boys, they kind of look cute and small and petite, but at the same time they look very kind of menacing and okay, well let's talk about the Night Bears first. They're a subset of the because the Bad Boys, that's functioning in one way in terms of cute menacing, and then the Night Bears are almost the flip side of that. So we talk about them first. They're a subset of, they came out of my research of the fence idea. We were talking about the fence earlier as an interface between feminism and between militarism, patriarchy, and the peace camps and all those good dualisms, male female even. And during the research, some of the books I read,
talked about how the Greenham woman would actually, they had a teddy bear's picnic at one stage. They all dressed up, a lot of them dressed up in teddy bear outfits and various other things. And the sense of fun at Greenham was very important to the women here. They were subversive and they had a good time here, as well as doing all sorts of things that put themselves at personal risk. They didn't forget to have a good time, and they were actually not just having a good time, they would quite often have a good time as a political act. And one of them was having this picnic where they would dress up and actually use all sorts of signs, the rainbows, the cobwebs, the snakes, all sorts of things that to them countered the dull, monochrome, serious, male, patriarchal sort of thing that they were protesting against, saying, hey man, you've got to think again. So the teddy bear thing kind of went in there, and at one stage I wanted to make some sort of floppy puppets and actually do some wall-mounted pieces where, all out of clay again, where I had the idea of these figures that I should say that the Greenham women, as part of the play, they would also tie puppets, dolls and all sorts of things, all sorts of different objects you can read about, that were tied to the fence to get into the heads of the soldiers here, yeah. And that morphed in my mind to the figure, because the fence was this interface, if you like. The childhood thing came in, which is one of my favourite themes. The idea of the child and the toy became one, and the idea of the teddy bear, and they all became what's hanging on the fence. So I saw these teddy bears on the fence, hence the crisscross lattice in the background there. And I wanted to imbue them with the sinister aspect because I saw these toys as male. So there's a paradox there. In my alternative universe of what happened at Greenham, I saw the Greenham woman tying these toys on this interface of male and female. What they were tying on from their perspective was paradoxical because it was a child, it was referencing the child, it was indexing the child, but at the same time they had issue with the male child. And then it comes back to all the stories that we tell our own children about how to behave, the gender roles. So that's what these figures represent to me, are trying to open the debate around gender roles, childhood, and what's lost, maybe. Yeah. 96 Bad Boys, how are we doing for time? We better move on. 96 Bad Boys references the fact that 96 cruise missiles were stationed at Greenham. Each one could be loaded up with a warhead that had 10 times the explosive potential, the TNT potential, of Little Boy, the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, Little Boy, they believe vaporized between 70 and 80,000 people, just like that. That, to me, is terrifying. So the fact that each missile here could be 10 times that, and then you had 96 of them, that's 960 potential Hiroshimas in the shelters here. That to me is completely, outrageous, the fact that we would have had one here. And in my research, there are quite often accounts from many military authorities, professionals, who say nuclear weapons don't work. So, that's what I'm trying to say here. 96 Bad Boys is a work of protest, but there's so many. To me, protest is a very difficult thing to try. People turn off as soon as they think they're anywhere near a protest. They get polarised. They're either like, I'm with them, I'll go and join them, or, oh God, here we go, I'm off. It's very hard to actually get inside somebody's head, and that's what I was trying to do with 96 Bad Boys, by drawing people in and making a very uncomfortable relationship between something that is playful, the child is playful, and the language of war, the language of militarism, which talks about Little Boy. The other bomb on Nagasaki was Fat Man. It's kind of this playful language, completely unacceptable in my view. But I'm doing it on visual terms there, and I'm doing it not because I want to play, because I'm deadly serious.
Of course. And the other paintings that I think stand out are the three on the side here, which are a diptych, and that you've named the gates. And I'm really interested in the titles of those. They're called Parity, Autonomy, and Commonality. So if you could just discuss a bit more about those. Okay, so the gates refer to I believe there were 8 gates. Somebody told me the other day there was actually 9, but in Sasha Rosenneal's book it was 8, so I took that as Bible, Gospel really. And each gate was assigned by the women who set them up a different colour. And along with the colour there was a different character. Main gate was Yellow Gate. Blue Gate, just up the road from that, was again sighted, quite active. And then other gates were more either for where the women came at weekends, or maybe one gate was younger, one was more conservative, one was more political activist, and whatever. Each one had its own particular character. And what I tried to do with these 3 paintings, which are quite untypical for me to do, was find a language that actually paid respect to the best of the Greenham women. I found it very hard to use a more figurative language that seemed appropriate, because a lot of my figuration is quite satirical and cartoon-like and whatever. I didn't want to put the women into that category, and if I tried to do serious representational painting, it just wouldn't have fitted with the other languages that I'm using. And what seemed important to me were the principles that the women upheld, that the press just didn't really give them any coverage in this. From this angle, it was always, oh, they're dirty, smelly lesbians, and the press did not help their cause at all. But they were very well organised, and one of the principles that Sasha Rosenneal talks about in her book was parity, the whole idea that whether you were a Greenham woman on the first day or you'd been there months, you all were treated with equal respect, and you all had the opportunity to speak. So you could come in day one and you could contribute. So formally in that, I tried to get, that's what the circle is about, that everything is assigned, but every colour has got the same amount of shape assigned to it. So it's a very regular abstract conception. On all 3, the monochrome shapes behind are my little sort of nod. There's only 4 of them, there are 6 shelters, but if you look at the shelters from the air, they're kind of like squat pyramids almost. So I've kind of taken that and tried to nod. I don't mind if people get that or not, but the background, the monochrome background, is meant to be the male against the female, so the colour is the life. Alongside the idea that everybody had an equal voice, they were all expected to act with autonomy. So if you got up one day, got out your bender tent and thought, oh, I feel really angry, I want to go and do something, you didn't have to ask permission. Say, oh, I'm thinking of acting in this capacity. You didn't need to do that. You could go as a Greenham woman and just go and sit or cut the fence or do anything, but you had to own it. So that's what the second one is about. And then the third one was communality, the fact that they all looked out for each other. And the whole idea that everything was shared, everybody took the whole idea. And obviously these are principles. There were examples where that didn't work, but overall these are principles that were upheld, and I was fascinated to learn. I think Rosenneal mentions another 5 different principles, I think one of which was fun actually, or playfulness, I got 3 paintings out of it. The way the forms change, in the autonomy, they're obviously going wherever they like, as opposed to the first one. And in the third one, there's a little nod to embrace the base, which happened in December 1982, where up to 50,000 women all joined hands around a 9-mile perimeter. And, in an act of solidarity against the arrival of the weapons, which came soon after. So just quickly there, if we just go back to that slide,
There are some photographs, more photographs there, which relate to, down here, question 8, materials and process.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that you've returned to more two-dimensional materials, I guess painting in this exhibition, and in companion pieces you did explore sculpture and ceramics, but you didn't for this exhibition. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, time, size of the room, and what I wanted to say. I mean, what I ended up showing here is probably about half of what I did. That doesn't mean that I've got lots more like 96 Bad Boys, but I did a lot of work and then focused in on trying to produce a homogeneous show. Now, even then, the 3 Greenham paintings are quite different to some of the other work. So I really tried to rein it in, and I wanted to maybe just come back to what most people would say is painting. So yeah, you can see paint on a flat surface. That's what I was trying to do. In the companion pieces show, I still felt it was all about painting, but I mentioned this writer I've been reading a lot of, Isabel Graf, a few key books by her. She talks about the non-medium specificity of painting now, that painting can mean is happening in a lot of different ways and needs to be redefined, more to do around signs and very personalised sign systems. It's not about oil paint on canvas anymore. But I'm kind of old school, and I feel very much that wherever I go, branching out into ceramics or whatever, I'm always going to come back to working with either oil paint, acrylic, ink or mixed media on a flat surface. And it's going to hang on a wall and look pretty much like a modernist painting or anything possibly maybe even earlier than that, rather than it branching out to being, I don't know, painting maybe like an Albert Olin or maybe something even crazier where, people are using digital media, for example. Well, I'm pretty much analog still. I use a lot of digital processes to maybe create images in terms of preparing them, but I'm very much realising stuff in the analog world, and I don't think that's going to change.
And the materials that you've used for this exhibition, are you going to continue using that for future series? I'm going to keep on. I'm going to be working in oil. I'll be using acrylics and experimenting with print and combining print media with. And what I mean there is not digital print, but woodblock and woodcut and monotype. I'll be using those and kind of where the prints don't work, I quite often use those mounted on a panel to actually initiate a painting rather than paint directly. But one of the things I really want to try and explore is, in summary, is I want to take more about the immediacy of a mark. Quite often my paintings in recent years have involved layering and lots of, not layering of meaning, layering of paint surfaces. And I think I really want to try and open, when I look at the artists that I'm really getting off on, I think I mentioned in my last talk, Patricia Tribe, people like that, where they're laying paint on a surface and by whatever means they're putting that paint down, it is not much manipulated after it's gone down. Yeah, we were talking about Chinese brush painting at lunchtime, and if you've ever seen a Chinese brush painter paint, they're not doing this. They load the brush up and they lay the ink. So I'd like to maybe get to a point where there's more immediacy in the painting. How I do that, I'm not sure. In the immediate short term, I'm going to be taking the 96 Bad Boy motif and working that into some other images. Yeah, there's mileage in that motif that is, it's the start of something, I think.